Hallowed Sepulchre, a agility minigame that came into the game with Darkmeyer. And in this video we're gonna be discussing, should you do it? So, to answer the question that I posed myself, should you do Hallowed Sepulchre, and well, it just heavily depends. There are mainly three things to take into account if you are deciding to do it. Number one is player experience, 2 is AFKness, and 3 is GP and XP rates. While Hallowed Sepulchre is by far the best GP you can get through agility and is by far the best XP rates you can get through agility, it's also not very AFK, and when I mean it's not very AFK, I really truly mean it's not AFK at all. You need to actually pay attention and it's pretty click intensive, and ultimately there's a pretty steep learning curve when it comes to this minigame. So if you already have player experience when it comes to a lot of the movement mechanics, then yeah, probably you should give it a shot. Otherwise, maybe wait a little bit, because ultimately the minigame is really tilting to a point, so it heavily depends on the experience you have in the game. I would say that player experience is by far the most important thing to take into account when making the decision. The rest is just depends on your mood, I guess. So let's get actually into the meat of the minigame, which is the good, the bad and everything else. First of all, let's start with the good. Most of this minigame and most of the positives of this minigame hinges on the GP that you make and the XP that you get. This is incredibly good. Honestly, in terms of GP per hour, you can look to get anywhere between 300 to 500k GP per hour, not looting any chests, just looting the Grand Coffin alone. This can actually spike to like 700k if you actually do loot the chests, and if you even get the ring in drop rate, overall you are looking to get at 1.5 million GP per hour, which is pretty good for, you know, doing agility. You also get a nice amount of XP per hour. You get upwards of 80k XP per hour in my experience. I was getting around 50 to 70k, being more realistic, primarily because of the RNG of the minigame and getting distracted and everything. So overall, it's literally the best XP per hour while also making a fuck ton of profit, while also completing the log. Overall, it's actually really good. On top of all of that, Floor 1 also offers comparable XP rates to the RD course while requiring only 52 agility, and on top of that you can also loot the chests there, so you're also even making more profit than you do at RD. You need level 90 agility to unlock the RD rooftop course, so overall, again, just by the Floor 1 alone, it's already way better than doing the hardest or the highest level rooftop agility course. So now that that's out of the way, let's actually talk about the problems that the minigame has, because there's a lot of them, and believe me when I say that most of these minigames good thing come exactly from the XP per hour and the GP per hour. First of all, the minigame is incredibly frustrating. Like, things can go wrong extremely quickly, and because of the timer you can actually get little to no rewards from your entire trip. If you're going for the log, for example, and getting the ring, if an obstacle goes wrong and you lag and you spend a little bit more time than you should, that's it, you no longer get the ring, and that's just 10 minutes wasted of your time. So it can be incredibly frustrating. A lot of the obstacles and these combinations really just aren't that challenging either, they're more annoying. You also require a pretty high level of agility. It's, you know, the 5th floor requires level 92 agility to get access to, which is where one of the major rewards come from, which is the ring, because the ring only drops from the Grand Coffin on floor 5, because the other floors do not have a Grand Coffin at the end of the level. The timer is also a major pain, given that for the most part it really does not affect experienced players. It mostly affects learners, because if the timer runs out, your access to the next floor gets locked, impacting your XP per hour, but at the same time you are also not able to get any rewards anymore, so you're not able to get to the chest rooms if the timer runs out, so you get little to no rewards. You get a major impact on your XP per hour just for trying to learn, while most experienced players don't need to worry about the timer, because for them it's mostly consistent. When you pair that up with a high difficulty curve, this is even worse. So the minigame is already not a lot of reward to learn, because of the timer, and on top of that, because of how difficult it is, that will actually last for a long time. It took me 20 hours to get consistent runs. That's 20 hours where your XP per hour sometimes will be 0 because you're still trying to like figure out the floor and figure out how to get past certain obstacles, and again, not a lot of GP, especially if you're prioritizing learning, which means that for the most part you probably are not gonna go for the chests, so you have the most amount of time to figure out the obstacles to get to the next floor so you can practice the next floor. That timer also doesn't really help the fact that it's a bit weird how to get past certain obstacles. Back previously I said that getting past certain obstacles for the first time can feel like a puzzle, and that is good if you don't count the fact that you have a time pressure on top of you that just makes it super frustrating to try and figure out because you have no idea how to get past certain things. So it really feels like you have to watch a guide just to know how to actually even do the minigame in the first place. The minigame really isn't that intuitive, and the timer really impacts that. It also feels that tile markers are pretty much almost required. This is the first place in the game that I actually use tile markers. I don't use tile markers anywhere else, but I just wanted to make it this little bit easier to do the minigame, so I felt like I had to use them here. All of that obviously is because this is a minigame that is based on a movement mechanic, which, let's be honest, movement mechanics in RuneScape really aren't the most complex. So this just leads to a lot of these things being far more frustrating than, you know, you actually sitting there trying to figure out how the system works. There's also a pretty considerable inconsistency in terms of times, as some paths have a higher difficulty or simply they take longer to set up certain obstacles and go through certain obstacles. For example, in floor 4, the southern path to me would take on average 30 more seconds than the northern path. Being consistent, this also leads to the fact that the first 3 floors, the hardest obstacle is the last obstacle on floor 3, right? And after you beat it, you feel really good about yourself. But floor 4 and 5 feel like that obstacle is every single obstacle. That's a huge difficulty ramp up just on those 2 floors alone. The ring is also pretty much required. The ring that you get from the minigame is pretty much required to actually do the minigame, as it mitigates damage, so it prevents you from, or you don't need to bring any food to the minigame, and on top of that you don't need to sacrifice inventory load with or space with food. However, that ring is actually not highlighted in the minigame, and it's pretty expensive for players to actually buy, as it costs 250 tokens compared to the 100 tokens of some other objects that you can buy in the store, when the ring is pretty much required for you even to do the minigame. And these aren't exactly bad things necessarily, they're more like minor concerns that I have. The first one is that sometimes there's an issue where if you get hit on an obstacle, the respawn point is in the previous obstacle, so if your immunity runs out and you don't react fast enough, you might get hit by that obstacle instead and then go to the beginning of that obstacle. So you essentially have to repeat another obstacle that you already did, because the obstacle after that teleported you into that obstacle that made you get hit. Didn't happen too many times, but the 2 times I think it happened, felt really bad because it felt like it was not my fault whatsoever. The minigame floors also aren't instanced, which means that the cycles actually aren't running all the time, but they start once someone gets into the floor. This means that most of the times you would rather actually do the minigame completely alone in a world that doesn't have a lot of players, because when you do have players, the cycle starts before you get to the floor, which can impact the consistency that you have when doing the minigame. So it just doesn't make it feel very good doing the minigame with other players. And there are some places where the camera will actually get stuck sort of behind the object, where it will block certain parts of the view to certain obstacles. A good example of this is on floor 5 in the left side, on the lowest floor in the left side, once you are on the teleporter and arrow obstacle. Because I like to have my camera facing the arrows coming towards me so I can more easily dodge them, when I place my camera towards that direction, the beginning of the obstacle is blocked by the stairs, so I actually cannot see the arrows coming towards me, or I cannot see the ground where to click, purely because of the stairs, and that can sometimes be a bit of an issue. Now, the technical difficulties section is or was part of the bad section, but then I decided to give it its own section because I think it's kind of important to talk about these things on their own. First of all, let's just talk about the low visibility. I personally play on a low-end computer, and for the most part, because of all of the animations going on, they overheat my laptop, which means that I actually have a small draw distance, and on top of that I have the low graphics setting turned on, the plugin, which honestly just makes it really hard to see which tiles you actually can walk on. The visual cues in the entire minigame also have a tendency to not match the hitboxes in my experience. I mean, outside of the flame wizards, this makes it feel like most of the times the hits aren't even your fault, they're the game's fault, which is not a thing that you want a player to experience. The arrows can hit you both when you're ahead of them and behind them. The swords are almost even worse in that regard, and the teleporters just seem to light up, but oftentimes the animation is delayed when they are active, which is already problematic because the teleports are active for such a short time span. I think it's something like 4 ticks. This will also sometimes differ from player to player. I have seen players get hit by things that I just completely dodged. Sometimes I get it behind the arrow while the other player gets it in front of it, but then when they dodge throughout behind the arrow, when I got hit by it, they actually dodge it as well. It's overall like really confusing, and it seems to not even be on a player by player basis. Not to mention that I've had experiences where sometimes you can just literally go through an arrow and not get it due to like the absolute mismatch of the hitbox versus the animation of the character, which can make it even more confusing for inexperienced players. Overall, these just makes the obstacles all not that fun. Which, speaking of the obstacles, let's actually talk about the obstacles individually. The flame wizards, as I mentioned, they're completely fine. I think that their hitboxes are clear. Most of the times when you get it, you understand you got it because it was your fault. No problems there. The lighting wizards are almost fucking useless. Most of the times you can actually just run past them as long as you are on the correct cycle, which kind of defeats the purpose of dodging them. They're also in a predetermined pattern, so it's pretty easy to dodge anyway, so overall they're more of a nuisance than a challenge, and they also don't reset the obstacle when you get it, but as a result it makes it feel more like they are lag than they are necessarily providing a worthy challenge. Flying swords could be fun if their clickbox wasn't so wonky. Arrows could be fun, but because they are RNG dependent, sometimes the RNG can make them really annoying, especially if the arrow on the middle is always coming towards you, so you have to dodge from left to right all the time. This makes it really hard to make progress because of the arrow's interval, and again, it makes it incredibly annoying. And the teleporters are super annoying. In fact, the teleporters have more issues on themselves than every other obstacle combined. Aside the fact that, again, they have bad hitboxes, and since they stay lit for a very short period of time, these hitboxes mismatch towards what the lighting is versus what you actually can take the teleport makes it even worse. Most of the times this actually just makes you want to avoid the teleports instead of engaging with them. When I'm running over teleports, I just hope that they don't actually light up as opposed to actually trying to engage with them, because yellow teleports teleport you a short distance backwards, but blue teleports teleport you a short distance forwards. But I don't even want to engage with that because of how annoying they seem to be. Most teleportations usually happen accidentally, as if you walk over them, there's like a 50-50 chance that you might get teleported or you might not get teleported. Clicking on them on the exact square is the only way to actually guarantee a teleport, but you might also not get teleported because the time span that the teleport is lit is so small that by the time your character actually reaches it, the teleporter might have already changed. It's also extremely disorienting when you get teleported accidentally, because instead of making you dodge into or from the obstacle, sometimes you dodge into the obstacle because you were in a certain lane and then it changed to another lane because of the teleport. You do have some teleport immunity, but even then, those timings seem to be a bit random at times, where sometimes you have a longer immunity, especially if you're teleported through a blue teleport, but yellow teleports don't seem to have as long as of a immunity, and all of these, you don't have any teleport cooldown, which means that if you get teleported, you can get teleported into another teleport, which then teleports you again, which makes it even more annoying. When you already coupled with the fact that the teleports have such a short time span, with the fact that they are completely RNG when they light up and when they don't light up, it just makes teleports completely unfeasible and incredibly annoying to actually deal with them. So, with all of that being said, let's talk about the changes. First of all, I would fix the hitbox/visual cue fidelity. I don't know how feasible this is mostly just engine thing, blah blah blah, server blah blah blah, so... But at least I would try to make it a little bit better, because at the moment it seems to be sucky. I don't know if this is because of low NPC necessarily, but if it is, again, it's a bit bad that people that play on lower NPCs have to struggle on the minigame harder than those who don't. So maybe some changes in there are in order. I would also increase the floor visibility. Sometimes it feels like you are standing in the middle of two tiles because of how the graphics work in Hallowed Sepulchre, so maybe changing that would be a little bit better as well. The teleporters should simply have longer durations and the longer cooldown applied after being teleported, inclusive when teleported from another teleport. It would make it just easier for people to adapt and not, completely get disorientated when getting teleported, as well as making teleporters more feasible to actually be used. The timer, in my opinion, just is exactly not needed for the minigame. The loot doesn't respawn, so you kind of have to, get the loot at the same rate regardless of having a timer or not. If you want to have the timer, because Pyramid Planner also has the timer to prevent exorbitant XP rates per hour or whatever, you could just change the timer to prevent getting loot after the timer runs out, but also allow players to still proceed to the next floor and at least get the agility XP. This would make it way less punishing for players to learn, since they don't really need to worry about the timer to actually learn the obstacles. They can just take it at their own pace. Because again, the timer mostly affects entry level players, not players that are already experienced with the minigame, and on top of that, you already require a certain agility XP to unlock the floor anyway, so for the most part it's kind of useless to have the timer affect the agility XP and the ability to go to the next floor as well. I understand that each floor gives you plus 2 minutes, and that's why you don't want to allow players to go to the next floor after those 2 minutes to get more loot, but I don't think the change would be necessarily that hard. When the timer runs out, you just don't give them enough time, or don't give them more time. Make paths more consistent and less reliant on RNG. At first I thought you should be able to choose the paths, but then I realized that players probably just wouldn't choose certain paths at all, so I would just put them on a clock rotation, where for example floor 4 you get northern path, southern path, northern path, southern path, so you get them alternated. Same for top floors and everything, so every floor is a go, and you also have a go at every floor, and there's not a lot of RNG then reliant there, because you sort of know which floors you're gonna get. Make the ring 1 or 10 tokens so players don't pass it up due to being expensive, given that it's kind of an important thing in order to do the minigame. Having it be super cheap tokens allows players to just do a trial run in the minigame, see if they like it and want to invest in it, and then buy the ring to allow them to actually start learning the minigame. Again, the ring is actually faster at respawning you from an obstacle, from getting it from an obstacle, because they don't take damage. So the ring should be super cheap, or at least be given for you for free, so players don't actually pass it up, especially players that don't watch a guide and just do the minigame and not realize that that ring is actually kind of important to use in the minigame. Also, prevent the prior obstacles from teleporting you to be the beginning of them. If you already beat them, that shouldn't happen. Simply changing locations from the current obstacles to never overlap with previous obstacles should be enough to solve this issue. Make the minigame either instanced or keep cycles running all the time. I understand that they don't want to keep cycles running all the time, because then the problem with the hitboxes versus visual cues will become kind of bad, since there's a higher margin of error, since the cycles just keep running all the time. but if that's the case, allow players to just have an option to actually like buy an instance or something like that, so you know the cycles can actually be consistent as opposed to having to opt to a world that doesn't have any players. Make the stairs less visible when, you know, doing certain obstacles, because sometimes again the camera can block its view. And lastly, the pet transmog should not be 3000 marks. That is just way too expensive for a pet transmog, especially if you already have the pet. Like, the pet is the hardest part to get, not the transmog, so I don't understand why the transmog is so expensive, so I would just make it a tiny bit cheaper. And that's all I had to talk about when it comes to Hallowed Sepulchre. Now you know everything about it, and you know if you would like to do it or not.